We were up at high altitude, so about 5,300 meters altitude. And we had a person who was really, really strong, doing well in the group. They'd been up actually a little bit higher than that the previous day to about 5,400 meters. And they were feeling absolutely fine the evening before. But then the next morning they woke up feeling a little bit groggy. And they said a couple of things that, made me a little bit concerned that something might not be quite right. And they said that they didn't have enough appetite for breakfast, so they weren't feeling very hungry. And they had a little bit of a headache. And that was the main thing. And they felt really, really fatigued.
That's Nathan Hudson-Peacock, an emergency medical doctor and anesthesiologist with a special interest in providing medical care in remote and extreme environments. In 2019, Nathan was serving as an expedition doctor to a group that was hiking in the Indian Himalayas in the Zara Valley.
On paper, that just sounds like a bit of mild altitude sickness, nothing too much to worry about. But something was making me suspicious that this might be something that turns out to be more than that. And I think it was to do with the speed at which it developed.
But Nathan wasn't this man's doctor. This climber was part of another group that had a different physician with them.
And I had just caught up with them in passing while I was on the way to the glacier higher up. And I remember saying to that group, I said, I know he seems okay at the moment, but it's probably best if you just start heading back down towards base camp, just in case. So we went off up to the glacier, and about 3 hours later we came down and we just saw one tent pitched on the side, and it made me think, oh no, something's happened here.
Over the course of about an hour, the man had gone from a little headache and fatigue to a terrible headache, vomiting, struggling to stay awake, and barely being able to stand. What he was experiencing was cerebral edema, where a lack of oxygen causes fluid to build up in the brain, leading to increased pressure, which can then damage the brain even more.
So at that point, it was really a case of how do we get this patient from here, where we're at 5,300 meters, to base camp, which was at 4,900 meters. And it's quite a long way, like a good couple of hours. And we had to cross quite a big river as well at the bottom. And he was no longer able to walk. And we're in a bit of a pickle because the stretcher was down at base camp and the oxygen was up at the glacier camp. So we had some communication challenges as well. And just to add to the mix, there was a storm coming in.
Welcome to Tiny Matters, a science podcast about the little things that have a big impact on our society, past and present. I'm Sam Jones, and I'm joined by my co-host, Deboki Chakravarti.
Sam, when I read your draft for this episode, this is the point where I was so stressed out. And so I really just wanted to know what was going to happen. And I assume our listeners also would like us to just get to the point.
Yeah, that's true. But I think we should let them suffer for like 2 more minutes while we introduce this episode.
Okay, fine. We can do that. I apologize. This was Sam's decision, not mine.
Blame me.
Sam's draft. Today on the show, we're going to hear the rest of that story, which is actually just the tip of the iceberg, pun intended, because this episode is all about expedition medicine. You'll hear about some amazing trips, how this career has changed our guests' outlook on the world, and what it takes to prepare for extreme environments. But of course, even with all the preparation in the world, things can still go wrong. So Nathan was in the Indian Himalayas around 5,300 meters up. That's over 17,000 feet for us Americans. And this man needed medical help. On top of that, a storm was rolling in and lots of people were wearing crampons, the metal spikes that people attach to their shoes to get traction on ice or snow. But you know what loves metal? Lightning.
So you don't really want to be essentially a big lightning rod on the top of a mountain as an electrical storm comes in. So there was all of this stuff going on at the same time. And I think it was a challenge in terms of maximizing the potential for teamwork here. So we really had to divide and conquer.
They sent 2 people up toward Glacier Camp to grab oxygen, and then sent 2 people toward base camp to grab a stretcher. As all of that was going on, the doctors, including Nathan, started treating the patient as best they could. They got an IV line in and gave him a drug called dexamethasone, a strong steroid that would help reduce the brain swelling. Then they began making their way toward base camp. They didn't get far, but thankfully the oxygen and stretcher soon arrived.
And then we started a very long and heavy, slow stretcher carry. Bearing in mind, he was a big guy, probably at least 80 kilos, and we all had about maybe 15, 20 kilo backpacks on. So trying to carry that plus a stretcher in the freezing cold at over 5,000 meters was hard work for everyone involved.
And then you might remember there was a river they had to cross. For my millennials out there, this is really starting to feel like the worst part of Oregon Trail.
So we set up 2 lines of people and we were passing the stretcher down the line of people. Eventually managed to get him back to base camp into a Jeep and off to hospital, which was about a 12-hour drive away. And he did really, really well. So by the time he got back to base camp, the dexamethasone kicked in, the oxygen had started doing its thing, the lower altitude had started helping, and he's feeling much better. And by the time he got to hospital, he was feeling good as new in the hospital, like, what are you guys doing here?
That's a very, very happy ending to what could have ended up a really awful story. Being an expedition doctor sounds like it could be terrifying at times, but also so fulfilling, and it feels like a really unique experience, right? Like I hadn't even thought about it as a career before, and until 2018, Nathan hadn't either. He was working in emergency medicine, partway through his foundation training, which is essentially the UK version of a residency. And he decided to attend a conference on expedition medicine. But Nathan admits he didn't exactly go for the talks.
The conference was in Chamonix in the Alps. And so it was a really great way for me to be able to go to a conference while also get some skiing in.
But Nathan had an open mind. And he had to admit the whole expedition doctor thing was kind of intriguing.
And on the first day of the conference, my expectations were to maybe go to 1 or 2 of the talks and then try and get away and go do some skiing.
But then Nathan went to a talk by physician Lucy Obolensky, who started in the UK's national health system before going into expedition medicine.
She had eventually started working for David Attenborough on many of his expeditions, and she had all these incredible stories and videos and pictures from around the world, going to all these places that just never even crossed my radar as places that exist, let alone I could potentially actually visit myself. And I think over the course of that one day, just something changed in my mindset. It went from, having this very medically focused hospital view of my entire future career to something that was actually, okay, hang on a minute. So maybe medicine could be my passport to seeing the world and using medicine as a way to go to places where people maybe have never been before or maybe very rarely get to visit.
Nathan was all in. He threw himself into the rest of the conference, trying to soak up anything he could.
Learning about everything from navigation to altitude sickness to snake bites to all of that stuff.
To date, Nathan has been on well over a dozen big expeditions to volcanoes, the Sahara, the polar regions, tropical jungles, marine environments.
I've definitely gone for the variety approach because for me, it was the thought of going to places in general that are less frequently visited that really excited me. It wasn't like I came into this from being, a born and bred mountaineer or a born and bred, polar explorer from a young age. I was just enchanted with the idea of traveling to these places. And then when it came to the actual medical side of things, I actually just fell in love with expedition medicine itself and all of the risk assessment, the thinking about how to deal with medical problems in different environments.
Nathan told us that the times he's had to go into emergency medicine mode on an expedition are often related to altitude, specifically altitude sickness, which can cause nausea, shortness of breath, exhaustion, and of course, if things escalate, cerebral edema, pulmonary edema, and even death.
Monica Piris knows a thing or two about altitude sickness. That's because she's spent much of her life in the mountains. She's been a high-altitude expedition doctor for nearly 2 decades.
The first expedition I went on in 2007 was an Everest expedition, and it started at the end of March, and it didn't end until the end of June. So back in those days, it was quite standard for an expedition to last 8 weeks. Now they're much shorter, and they tend to last something like between 4 and 6 weeks.
I was thinking that they're shorter because the routes up the mountain have changed and become more direct or something, but Monica told us that a big reason is because we don't need as long to acclimatize as researchers previously thought. and because you can start the process long before you reach the expedition destination.
Nowadays, there's also some new technology which allows people to pre-acclimatize to altitude using specific kind of machines in their home, where they sleep in a special tent that slowly removes some of the oxygen from the air so that they can expose themselves progressively to air containing less oxygen.
This is a great advance, but not everyone can afford the latest tech. And even if they could, nothing guarantees that someone won't get altitude sickness.
So what happens when we go up in altitude is that the atmospheric pressure reduces. So there is less pressure at the top of Mount Everest than there is at sea level. An easy way to think about this is if you think about the column of air above your head is shorter if your head is higher up. And so the weight of that column is less. The pressure that it's exerting around you is less. And what happens when there's less atmospheric pressure is that all the molecules in air are more spread out.
So as you go up a mountain, you're taking in fewer oxygen molecules with every breath, which obviously is not great for your body.
Right, but at the same time, our bodies have adaptations so that if you go up the mountain slowly enough, you'll be able to handle the lower oxygen availability. Within hours of reaching altitude, your breathing rate and resting heart rate will increase, and within days, your blood plasma volume will go down. With less plasma, you're left with a higher concentration of red blood cells, the cells that carry oxygen from the lungs to tissues throughout the body. But once you're off the mountain, that acclimatization doesn't last forever. It doesn't even last months.
Acclimatization lasts for a few weeks, but not longer than that. And so say you do an Everest base camp trek in the spring, if you then go home to sea level and don't go back to altitude until the fall, you're probably not going to have retained any acclimatization. But what does change is your perception of suffering. So that changes with experience. You come to know your body and how it reacts, and you become familiar with all these kind of uncomfortable symptoms that going to altitude involves, and therefore you experience them less. So that was something that I noticed a lot over the years. People who had experienced altitude before a certain expedition were much more at ease with what was occurring to them, what was happening to them on that trip, when you compared them to people who had never been to altitude before.
Monica told us that for almost every expedition she's been on as a doctor, there's someone who's needed to pull back to take more time, or it's been clear they can't even safely attempt the climb.
If there's any listeners out there who are thinking, oh, I might want to try and climb a high mountain, it's something that I always say is really important for people to take on board, is that you have to be really humble when you go to these big mountains, because you may not succeed and it may be outside of something that you can control. You know, you may acclimatize poorly, you may be unlucky and get a kind of concomitant infection. Just a cold is enough to hinder your acclimatization potential, so that you just don't have time. You're no longer able to tolerate the kind of the harshness of the lack of oxygen. So yes, definitely having to turn around is common and should be accepted. And not listening to those signs, or not knowing what signs it is that you should be looking for, is dangerous.
Those signs include headache, nausea and vomiting, shortness of breath, fatigue, and of course, those symptoms can escalate. We've added a link with signs to look for at the bottom of the episode transcript. And at Everest Base Camp, altitude sickness is just one worry of many, because there are often thousands of people around, so picking up a bug is pretty common. Colds, stuff that causes diarrhea and vomiting, urinary tract infections, just lots of infectious diseases, all of which will feel so much worse when you're up over 5,000 meters. Also, Everest is cold.
My argument is that frostbite should always be avoidable unless you happen to have had an accident or, some traumatic event. Nobody should really be getting frostbite nowadays, but it's an education thing. And then trauma. Climbing mountains can be extremely dangerous and difficult, and it can be relatively easy, but the possibility for trauma is always there. So a mountain like Everest is not technically difficult. You don't need to be an amazing mountain climber to succeed at climbing Mount Everest, but there is always the danger of an accident or an avalanche or an ice collapse or something like that. So trauma is another thing that you need to look out for.
And then, of course, there are things that could happen anywhere, not just on Everest. A stroke, a heart attack, gastrointestinal bleeding. The difference is that you're on a very, very tall mountain. Monica told us the story of an amazingly fast rescue. A Sherpa who had a stroke who was airlifted from the mountain in just 3 hours. But not everyone has been so lucky. People die on Everest almost every year.
Since 1921, over 330 people have died on the mountain. The exact number seems somewhat debated, but the last stat that I saw was 344 people. And of the people who have died, more than half of the bodies have proven too dangerous to retrieve, and so they remain on the mountain. Over the years, I've seen stories about the, quote, bodies on Everest, and even saw an article claiming that Everest is, quote, littered with dead bodies. That's a creepy image, and so it really stuck with me. And I wanted to know how clickbaity those kinds of stories and titles are. And so I asked Monica about it.
So a lot of the bodies are physically removed and returned to their family or buried, have some sort of burial ceremony there in the Khumbu Valley in Nepal. Bodies that aren't removed often will end up traveling down the glacier in a crevasse. They may get covered with snow or frozen in. And so they're just not kind of lying around.
Monica did tell us, though, that if someone has just died and their team hasn't been able to retrieve them or move them away from the route up the mountain, then climbers might encounter a body.
You may literally be stepping over a body or around a body because everyone is clipped to a fixed rope that is installed in the mountain to keep people safe. And often people who end up in difficulty, they just sit down and then they're unable to get up and then they die and they're clipped to the same rope that you're using to go up or down the mountain. So in that case, you may end up having to kind of sidestep around someone who has died recently.
So this was a super helpful clarification. But the reality is still that hundreds of people have died on Everest. And 2023 was in fact one of the deadliest years in Everest's history.
More and more people have access to trying to climb these mountains. A lot of them, I feel, are really underprepared and under-informed. And I think, as with everything, it's like the more you know about something before you try and tackle it, the better prepared you are to avoid problems. And this is really no different. So it's a little bit of that kind of dichotomy of we see everything on Instagram and it's all so beautiful and it all looks so easy and accessible, but actually before signing up, just maybe do a little bit of research and find out about it so that you are prepared. Because like we said before, every year people die on Mount Everest and almost all of those deaths are 100% avoidable if you make the right decisions at the right time.
Making the right decision at the right time is what Monica and Nathan train for. But it's not like they just show up to a location and wait to see what happens. They're unbelievably prepared.
If you like Tiny Matters, I know you'll love American Medieval from the Multitude Podcast Collective. American Medieval is a podcast about the Middle Ages, but with an American twist. Every week, Professor Matthew Gabriel is joined by an expert scholar to talk about either some bit of the medieval world itself or how Americans have throughout our history used the Middle Ages to say something about ourselves. If America has never been fully modern, it might be because we've always been a little bit medieval. There was a recent episode of American Medieval about Vikings. For whatever reason, I have always been fascinated by Vikings, but I learned that my knowledge of Vikings was I've been misinformed for many, many years. So that was a really fun one and one that I really enjoyed sending to a bunch of friends and family members. So subscribe to American Medieval in your podcast app now. That's American Medieval from the Multitude Podcast Collective. New episodes every Wednesday.
In terms of expedition medicine, really the most important part of it, and really the key part that people maybe talk about slightly less often because it's not quite so interesting perhaps, it's all about that preparation, because it really is, on expedition, it really is prevention is better than cure, like for sure. You don't want to be dealing with any sort of emergency when you're potentially days away or weeks away from a hospital. So really it's all about that preparation phase, and it's kind of the same approach no matter where we're going.
Nathan considers 3 major variables before a trip. First, the people. What's their fitness like? Do they have any pre-existing medical conditions? And going on this expedition, could they be susceptible to something going wrong?
Whether that's in terms of physical health or mental health, really getting an understanding of the participants that I will be going on expedition with. And that sometimes involves writing letters to their doctors, sometimes involves reviewing their medical records. If they're not fully optimized, sometimes involves some sort of training or optimization program, or them making some appointments with their specialist.
So say, for example, someone has a history of epilepsy, but hasn't had a seizure for 2 years. Nathan would still prepare for the worst case scenario.
So although they may not have had a seizure for a long time, when they go to altitude and the oxygen's thinner and you're a bit dehydrated and you're not sleeping so well, all of these things can lower the threshold for a seizure. So you might want to say, hey, make sure you bring some backup meds just in case, that sort of thing.
So first is the people, second is the place. What are the hazards that await you or might await you wherever you're going? Is it to the mountains where you might be dealing with altitude sickness and frostbite, or to the desert where you're worried about heat-related illnesses like severe dehydration or heat stroke, or snake and scorpion bites?
And then the other big part of the place side of things is, how do we get help if we need help? So can help come to us? And if so, what does that look like? How long does it take? If help can't come to us, then how do we get to help? And how far away is that help? So, for example, doing an expedition in the Swiss Alps is very different to doing it in Greenland, where in the Swiss Alps, you might be able to get a helicopter to a big hospital in a couple of hours. Whereas in Greenland, it depends on the weather. It depends on the availability of a pilot. You might need to go to another hospital in another country, so it could potentially be over a week.
And the last thing is the activity. What's happening on the expedition? Is it a flat hike, or is there the risk of falling?
For example, in Greenland, we were potentially working at height, so from a rope. So there's potential for harness hang syndrome, there's potential for falls from height, there's potential for rock fall. And then around the base camp itself, there's potential for trauma from polar bear attacks, from wolf attacks. So many of us had a flare gun and a rifle just in case of emergency.
Okay, so wolf and polar bear attacks seem like a good thing to prepare for, but I had never heard of harness hang syndrome until Nathan mentioned it.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it either.
It's also sometimes called suspension trauma, and it happens when someone's in a harness for a long period of time, being very still or not moving at all, either because they're focusing on what they're doing, or maybe they were hit in the head by a falling rock, for example, and so they're unconscious. So blood begins to pool in their legs and they start to black out.
And so then your body struggles to pump that oxygen back from your legs back up against gravity to your head. And so it can lead to further blackout and problems as a result of that. Initially, it was thought that that was entirely due to just blood pooling in the legs. And that underpins one of the bits of advice for this, which is if you are on a harness stuck for a long time, it's good to keep your legs moving because the calf muscles help pump the blood back up. But there is some other thoughts that maybe there's something else going on driving that pathophysiology as well. But that is like the primary thought of what's going on at the moment.
And although it's rare, harness hang syndrome can be fatal if a person is not rescued pretty soon after they fall unconscious. Another thing I asked Nathan about were snake bites and scorpion stings. For some reason, cannot tell you exactly why, one of the supplies that I thought an expedition doctor must have are antivenoms. But as it turns out, that's rarely the case, in part because antivenoms have a high anaphylaxis rate, and also because they typically need to be refrigerated. But in asking this question, I learned something really cool related to preparedness. So if you're in a place with scorpions and you're going out at night, don't rely on a headlamp to spot them. Scorpions blend into their environment very well. So instead, bring a UV light. Scorpions have a UV reactive exoskeleton, and so they'll glow.
That's very handy to know. So to recap, preparation includes considering the people going on the trip, the place, and the expedition itself. Also, maybe bring a UV light.
Can't hurt.
No. And when everything comes together perfectly, it can be a ton of fun, even life-changing.
It'd be hard to put my finger on any individual expedition as a highlight because they've all been absolutely amazing in different ways, from the local people to the people I travel with to the environment itself. But I think a particular highlight has to be going to North Greenland in 2023. And that was with a group from University of Innsbruck, Professor Gina Mosley and her team. And it was actually also with a National Geographic photographer, Robbie Schoen, who was documenting the expedition.
It was a small team, 6 people, including Nathan, plus a helicopter pilot. They set out to a peninsula in far northwestern Greenland called Wolfland. That's W-U-L-F-F, not the canine wolf. But there are wolves there if you're curious. The expedition was part of the Greenland Caves Project, a group focused on exploring Greenland's caves to collect Arctic climate data. The team wanted to gather samples of stalactites and stalagmites from these caves. These both look like massive icicles, but stalactites hang from above and stalagmites rise from the floor. They're both formed over millennia, the result of dripping water that's rich with calcium carbonate that then crystallizes and builds up.
So there was this humongous cave halfway up a cliff face in one of the most remote places on Earth that was only ever seen by photograph from a plane about 65 years ago during reconnaissance missions back in the 50s or 60s. And so this cave had become sort of the stuff of legend, where people had talked about it over decades and it had been mentioned in pubs over time, but no one had ever managed to launch a successful expedition there. And I remember very distinctly a particular day where myself and Gabby, one of the scientists, and Mateus, the helicopter pilot, we were just flying over the landscape and the cave came into view for the first time. And it was just so much more magnificent and crazy to see it with my own eyes that I actually started crying in the helicopter, it was quite overwhelming, but it was just amazing.
In listening to stories from Nathan and Monica, it's clear that they absolutely love what they do. It's not just a job. It's so much a part of who they are. Here's Monica talking about how she feels standing at the base of a mountain.
I guess for me, it's an awe of the beauty of it all. And it's the feeling of how insignificant we really are. You know, we are so minute and so tiny and so insignificant. And when you're out in the mountains, you get that perspective. It's like, okay, yeah, the world is big. I'm only here for a tiny moment in time, and I'm pretty insignificant. And so it just, I don't know, I find that a really humbling but also therapeutic kind of perspective.
For Nathan, being an expedition doctor has dramatically shifted his understanding of the world, in particular, how we're playing a role in climate change.
I think I probably shared a similar view on climate change to a lot of people before I started doing expedition medicine. It's something that I'd learned about at school. It's something that I'd read a lot about. I had awareness of it, but it still seemed like kind of a distant problem that is a future issue for our children and our children's children and all of this side of things. And I mostly thought of it as an environmental problem before going on expedition. But that perspective, I think, has changed since I've been on my various expeditions around the world, from it being a future problem to something that is actually very much a now problem. And it's something that is very much a human problem rather than just an environmental problem. You know, us expedition doctors were fairly uniquely placed to be witnessing firsthand some of the effects of climate change, meeting some of the people who are affected by climate change, and also being able to then bring back these stories to our home countries, potentially in Western countries, where we have the ability to spread that message and to try and influence things for better. Because a lot of the time, the people who are most affected by climate change now, and I don't mean in the future, they are people who don't necessarily have a strong voice, especially when pitched against the big corporations and politicians that often dictate the narrative around climate change.
Nathan saw firsthand how climate change is impacting people's lives when he traveled through a village called Kulum during an expedition in India. For years, the people in the village had relied on glacier melt in the spring to water their crops.
But because of global warming, the glaciers are now melting much, much earlier into spring, which means by midsummer there's a drought and they can't grow their crops. And so they aren't able to survive on their subsistence farming. And so now they're having to send their children to work in dangerous jobs on the roads and in cities to try and get money to be able to pay for food.
Hearing about this reminded me a lot of our episode from August 2023 about how climate change is having catastrophic effects on countries in the global south, including Pakistan, which was a main focus of that episode. It was actually an experience in Pakistan that motivated Nathan to make some changes in his own life.
The particular expedition here was to North Pakistan, to K2 base camp, where the team who are helping look after us were eating very simple foods with mostly lentils and rice, pretty much entirely plant-based, using very simple gear. And it was, juxtaposed with us coming in, eating like meat and dairy products, 3 meals a day, wearing the latest Gore-Tex and everything else. And these guys are still outperforming us on every level. So it kind of made me realize very obviously that we don't need all of this excess and this fancy gear and all of this food. And it was another thing that, because it was very remote, the food was kind of walking with us. So we had a little flock of chickens, we had a goat walking with us. They slowly, were getting killed throughout the expedition. So it kind of made it obvious the food that we're eating in a way that I'd never come face to face with before. We're very protected from the realities of where our food comes from. But at the end of the expedition, there was a sort of big celebration, and there was a goat which was slaughtered and then enjoyed as a meal between loads and loads and loads of people. It was made into a curry and fed to loads of people as part of this big celebration. And it made me realize that it was something that was really appreciated as a sort of special occasion in that context. And it made me think that actually day to day, I'm just eating meat and dairy and all these things just without even thinking about it.
So following that expedition, seeing the Pakistani team eating an almost entirely plant-based diet, spending time with the animals they would eat, and seeing how the impact of climate change was already a reality in that country, Nathan decided to only eat animal products on special occasions. And today, he follows a totally plant-based diet.
In terms of looking after our Earth's natural ecosystem to protect the carbon sinks in the oceans and in the forests, the most important thing that any individual can do is to reduce their animal product consumption. And that's come out in time and time again in various big studies. And so I think for me, it just made me realize that it is possible, and actually that the people who are affected by climate change are kind of already doing that. So I should try and do the same.
Shall we tiny show and tell?
Let's do it.
So, Tboki, I'm going to tell you about a finding from researchers at Uppsala University in Sweden. So they analyzed 4 shared graves from a 5,500-year-old hunter-gatherer community at Ivide, that's Ajvide. And Ivide is one of the best-known Stone Age archaeological sites in Scandinavia. And it's on the island of Gotland, which is part of Sweden. So the original belief was that each of these graves held people who were really closely related. So like mother and child or, like nuclear family, essentially.
Right.
But they did DNA testing. We love a good DNA test to clear up the historical record.
23andMe that historians the graves.
Truly. And they found that it wasn't the case. So in one grave, there was a young woman and 2 small children. You would think it's the mom and kids,
right,
something like that. But the children were siblings, but the woman was not their mother. It could have potentially been a half-sister, but they think also maybe aunt. And then in another nearby grave, they had 2 children who were buried together. They were not brother and sister. They were actually distant cousins. And then the 3rd grave did have a daughter and a father, but then the 4th had a girl and a young woman. And the woman could have maybe been a great aunt, possibly a distant cousin. So, DNA is really great, but exact genealogy is still really tricky,
right,
especially if you go beyond like sibling or parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
And so the reason I'm bringing this up, and I think it's just fascinating, is because it's an example of how people, even 5,500 years ago, knew their distant relatives. Like they were part of these really tight-knit communities that were not just the nuclear family, and where extended family was still incredibly meaningful, like to the degree that you would be buried with that person.
Right.
And I think that, I'm not speaking of burial practices, but like, I think that's still the case with many cultures in terms of like the extended family being so important and really being physically and emotionally close with those relatives. But like, just speaking for myself, I mean, I know a lot of my extended family, but I'm not exceptionally close with many of them.
Yeah.
I'm very close with my parents and my sister and my one living grandparent. And I like a lot of my extended family, but like I haven't lived near them in 15 years
If
or
you're in
more.
Sam's extended family and listening to this.
Yeah, I'm like, please email me at tinymatters@acs.org if you're extended family and you're mad about me saying that. But yeah, like I think it's so common in our generation, at least, like, I don't want to simplify this and say like in the United States, because again, like there's so much cultural diversity within the United States. But like, I will say that in my experience, in the experience of many people I know, particularly in our generation with millennials, like people live much further away from family or like I think maybe this study struck a chord or, piqued my interest because I recently had a baby. And so there's a lot of thinking about who's around your baby and who can be around your baby just due to distance, right? Like my family is all in New England. I'm in DC. Yeah. And they're wonderful and they're super involved, but it's not like they're a couple towns over. Right. Or, in the same house. It's a trip. Yeah. And I know you experience that as well with your family and in-laws. So I think we're in like a similar-ish situation in that sense. And yeah, it's like very cool seeing that these hunter-gatherers were just so tuned into who they were related to, even if it was like a third cousin, like you're close enough to bury those people together.
Right. Yeah. That is like really crazy. I was like wondering what, like if there was an idea of like what it meant for these societies to like have people in the graves like this. But like, I think you're right. Like it's really kind of reflects like how much like our family structures have changed. Like now that people live so much further apart, like on a regular basis, like a lot of people like live further away from their families. And yeah, it is really striking. I mean, even like I have friends whose parents are in the area. And so like, it's very different. Like the way that like their parents are able to like interact with their kids and also be available to help is just so different. And so like whenever I visit my parents, I'm like, oh, this experience of parenting is just like very different than like if I am at home and they're not nearby.
Right. I mean, I remember I don't remember. I was not born at the time, but my mom grew up like on the North Shore of Massachusetts, north of Boston, and then moved to the South Shore, literally an hour drive. And her parents were like, whoa, that is so far. Like, oh my,
long distance,
And now it's like the fact that I was in California before this and moved back to the East Coast, just being on the East Coast, even though I'm mid-Atlantic, not Northeast, like that was already like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You're so close.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when I think, because my parents grew up in India. And so like they grew up with their family. Like I don't know if they did, but other members of my family or like our family friends like grew up like in houses that like multifamily, everyone's related like to each other, intergenerational kind of housing. And it was kind of crazy, like going to visit and being like, oh, you guys are all related to each other. That's wild. Because it's just so different to how I think of it. Like, I don't know, family. And my dad grew up like with his cousins, like for a while, like he like stayed with some of them. Like, yeah, it's just a very different way of having family. And it's also really cool, I think, like to be able to have that kind of relationship. As much as I also like living where I live and everything, there are times where I'm like a little like, it would be so nice.
It would be so nice. It would, yeah. It's just, life is different. Careers are different. The way that like just, it's a blessing and a curse, like having that type of mobility, right?
It's also easy to like have a nostalgia for something you didn't experience, because it's like, I'm sure there's also a lot
people
of problems.
Who are like, it's kind of intense living right next to your parents, but I'm just going to pretend that, I don't know. It's like grass is always greener, right? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, I just thought this was kind of cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. It's cool to like relive or like resurrect the past in that way to like see kind of like what these ancient people.
Yeah. It also makes me think about these people as like they were people. Like I think sometimes we think about these ancient, hunter-gatherer communities and it's like
they're like so abstract.
It's so abstract. And so I think thinking about like their familial structures and how they all interacted and how important they all were to each other, like there were real connections, I would say, like love, caring, like it's just, it's, like they felt the things that we feel just in a time where they could have been eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. I don't know. Actually, I don't know. When were saber-toothed tigers around? Now I need to look that up. Is she being inaccurate? Probably. Oh, yeah. They were extinct 10,000 to 12,000 years ago after the last ice age. So forget I said that. Yeah. These people were not dealing with saber-toothed tigers, but they were dealing with a whole lot of things that we don't have to. So, but they were still, it was just cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I have a very different tiny show and tell today. Cool. I'm going to talk about a clinical trial for a gene therapy for lung cancer that I thought was really interesting. So longtime listeners might know this, but I did my PhD on engineering T cells to fight cancer. So this is like so up my alley. The idea, like very, very generally, like there's a lot of different types of specific therapies, but the way that these kind of therapies work overall is you're trying to make immune cells better at fighting cancer. So in particular, you might be trying to get them to express genes that make them better at finding a tumor, killing all the cells in it. That's the general way these therapies work. The one I'm talking about today focuses on getting these cells to make proteins called interleukin-2 and interleukin-12 that our bodies like naturally produce to fight tumors, which is already so cool. Like that our body naturally like makes these things. The problem is in cancer, those proteins often get depleted. Yeah. So that's all really cool. But the thing that I'm most excited about today is that this treatment is inhalable.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I was going to say I've heard about a lot of different, interleukin treatments. Right. But okay.
Yeah, yes. I'm so excited. I was so curious if you were going to be surprised by this because I saw that and I was like,
that was genuine surprise. Cool. Yeah, I love that.
Okay, so this particular clinical trial is around lung cancer, and one of the big challenges with lung cancer is figuring out how to actually deliver the drugs, the treatment to the lungs. These treatments are often given orally or intravenously, so it's just like, difficult to actually get to the lung that way.
You want to target the lungs.
Right. Yeah. But what's a great way to get to the lungs is by breathing. Mm-hmm. So in this therapy, patients are actually inhaling viruses. They're not dangerous. They're like specifically made for this purpose. And they have a gene encoding those interleukin-2 and interleukin-12 genes. So basically the viruses are going to be in a liquid that's then nebulized into a fine mist. So the patients are going to directly inhale it. They're going to get the virus.
So it's kind of just like I don't want to like editorialize, but sort of if you think of like a asthma inhaler.
Yeah, I think they might have it more directly as a mask. I'm sure,
yeah. It's not like puff, puff.
Yeah. Yeah. And you probably don't want it like going out and about. Yeah. But it's something that they would inhale. And so then the viruses will go to their lungs, infect the immune cells, and that will get the immune cells to make these interleukin proteins so that they can go on and fight the tumors.
So cool.
Yeah. So currently, they've only done like a really, really small trial with this. It's like, I think, very early on. They've tried it in patients who have advanced lung cancer and who weren't successful with other treatments. In 11 people who got this treatment, 3 had reduced tumor size, which is really cool. Like the tumors actually got smaller, and 5 had tumors that just stopped growing, which is also really, really great. Some people had side effects, but so far there were no major safety issues that came up in this, again, very small trial. There were only 11 people. But based on those results, the FDA has given this therapy a designation that will hopefully expedite the approval process if everything looks good so that it could be more available. But there are also like some important limitations. In particular, this therapy can only handle like the tumors in the lungs. It can't get to like other parts of the body that lung cancer might have metastasized to.
Right.
But hopefully, I don't know, hopefully if it works well, it might help people in the future. Maybe it prevents it from getting to that point. That would be my hope, at least, for how it could work.
Right. Yeah. Especially, if it's used earlier in the process, right?
Right. And then maybe in combination with other treatments. Because again, like I was saying, the big challenge with lung cancer is figuring out how to get the treatments to the lung.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hopeful because lung cancer is all cancer is horrible. Lung cancer is just, it feels like it's, I've read stories about it becoming like increasingly common.
And even in non-smokers, I don't remember. So, okay.
In non-smokers too. Because I think like growing up, I always thought like lung cancer is so specific to people who smoke.
Right.
And yes, it is way more prevalent in people who smoke, right? But like, there's a significant portion of people with lung cancer that it's, they haven't smoked a cigarette in their lives. And it's just amazing having, like with something like cancer, oh man, I could talk for so long. I had an Uber driver, like, I feel so bad. It was 2 years ago. For some reason we started talking about Tiny Matters because I'm sure I brought it up. I'm sure he asked me like what I do. And then I brought it up and I was like, you should listen. Because I think he said like, oh, I like science stuff. I don't like have training. And I was like, perfect. It's fine. Like, we love to dive into topics. We don't expect someone to be an expert if they're listening. But he was like, I would love you to do an episode on why we haven't cured cancer. And I was like, oh my God, like that has been on my list literally for 2 years. And it is just such a massive topic.
Yeah, it's like, where do we even start?
That is easily a 2-parter. So I've been trying to figure it out.
That might be a whole season parter.
That's a podcast, actually.
No, but it is also a great question.
It is. And I think it's just like, my point is like the more tools that we have in our arsenal, the better we are. Because like combo therapies for literally everything almost, like combo therapies are going to be the way to go. Yeah. Like more personalized medicine means that you need a lot of options for everything so that you can pick and choose, or your doctor can pick and choose what things are going to give you the greatest chance of success. Right. So I love hearing about these new studies because it gives me hope that toolbox is growing. Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Tiny Matters, a podcast brought to you by the American Chemical Society and produced by Multitude. This week's script was written by Sam, who's also our exec producer, and edited by Michael David and by me, Deboki Chakravarti. It was fact-checked by Michelle Boucher. Our audio engineer is Misha Stanton. The Tiny Matters theme is by Michael Simonelli and the Charts and Leisure team.
Thanks so much to Nathan Hudson-Peacock and Monica Piris for joining us. If you have an episode idea, email us tinymatters@acs.org. We'll see you next time.